Okay, remember that they are changing my voice. This video is about the requirements for a reasonable individual or society. Point number one is not reasonable if they do not acknowledge that the most logical assumption to the person who does not know for sure that there's a God is that there is. The atheist and the non-monotheistic religions have to address 7 things as the most logical assumption is that they prove that it is the most logical assumption that there is a God and that an individual or society should live as though there is. Also keep in mind that the explanation must be equally as likely or more likely in order for whatever explanation they're giving to be to confound the idea. So again, we're talking about the most logical assumption. For example, if you're in a military unit and there was something in the trees that strongly suggested there was a sniper, and you looked for patterns that would reveal whether or not there's a sniper, and you came to the conclusion that the most logical assumption is that there's a sniper, and that you have no way to deal with it. How should you proceed? As if there's not a sniper? Or as if there is? Now keep in mind, because of my ability to sense things, I know that there's a God. Okay, but you don't have to agree with me on that point to realize that the most logical assumption here for any individual or for society is that there is a God and they should do what's right, universally speaking, and not in mere racial social norms. Okay, we know that we live in a society with a long history of white supremacy. The Klan, which was made up of members from various Protestant churches, were white supremacists. The Catholic Church had their Inquisition. Okay, and you can't really tell the difference between the Orthodox, the Catholics, the Protestants, what have you, because they all kind of uphold white supremacy based social norms. White, Jewish, and LGBT supremacy based social norms here. Okay. So point number 1 is that there's 7 things that they must address here. So now let's talk about what they are. Okay, so the first thing is what came first, and that is, unless it is something that is so powerful that it does not need to have been created or to have come from something else. So you might argue that you don't know for sure time exists, but with the information given right now, the most logical assumption is that it exists and it's always existed. This is part of why atheists and people like that who are scrambling to try to change the culture of society are scrambling to come up with fake scientific studies that suggest other things. And quite often they put, things into the studies, like they'll make something look pink or something that shouldn't look pink to show you what they're doing. If you've been paying attention, you know what I'm talking about. The second point, why is the top martial arts ever possible when it comes to sparring? And to those who have sense, when it comes to character, wisdom, insight, sense, righteousness, justice, etc., and consider the justification of my actions and how it relates to the idea of justice. So why am I, the top martial artist ever possible, a monotheistic person when martial arts show us lifestyles and mental clarity? So why do I have the most mental clarity if you think I have this huge misconception? Obviously, I do not. And for those of you who aren't smart enough to understand that, obviously it's the logical assumption that I think more effectively when it comes to life matters. Martial arts are lifestyles, life paths. Okay, they have everything to do with life decisions. The third thing they must address is, why do the majority of humans have a drive to connect to something greater? Keep in mind that instincts exist for a reason, right? Pain exists for a reason. Being hungry, being thirsty, reflexes, what have you. So where do most people also have this instinct, this drive rather, which is like a form of an instinct, to connect to something greater? And here I am, the top martial artist ever possible, and that drive in me is a drive to connect to God. I'm being fumed here. Okay, so the fourth thing they must consider is, why does the concept of morality pre-exist mankind? Okay, so quite often these people argue that morality is magically relative. Okay, and so they compare it to the idea of God. And quite often people will tell you that if there is no God, then there is no morality. Okay? And some people say, well, maybe in Buddhism or this, that, and the other thing, right? But in a sense, Buddha is their God, and it goes back to semantics. In one way or another, the concept pre-exists mankind. Animals have a sense of right and wrong. Animals feel sad, what have you. And they've basically proven that scientifically. So why is that? And so you see that the creation coming into being, right? We'll get to that when we talk about idealness, creation, evolution, and reproduction. So the fifth thing, what are the odds that life exists under these conditions and that complex life forms are irreducibly complex? In other words, in order to get from one stage to another, you need to have the stage before it. And there's many stages. This stage went to this stage and on and on and on. Many, 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 many stages for us to get to here. So the odds that life exists under these circumstances, is a lot, it's a lot less likely than you might think because of the idea of life forms being irreducibly complex. Again, going from one stage to another and needing the stage before to get to the next stage. Okay, the sixth thing they must address is why is there one sun? And why can we not look directly at it with the naked eye for very long without suffering eye damage? Why wouldn't our eyes allow us to? Surely there is a message there when we couple that with the countless patterns in nature that point to a God. For example, the patterns of reproduction. Why do animals think it is so important to reproduce? So not only are they evolving, but they think it's important to reproduce. And that's part of their evolution. Why should there be a sex drive in the first place? Why does that possibility exist? Just because sex drives take us to where we are now as a planet doesn't mean that there is anything in nature that is a driving force that creates them. Okay? So the fact that, when we think about it, it's logical to assume that there is, and that driving force is God. That creative force is God, and to those who cannot sense God as the top martial artists can, it is most likely God with the evidence given. So when we look at it, why is that? Well, it's most likely a creator. Okay, so the creator is making the creation, and part of the mechanism in which he's doing so is evolution and reproduction, as opposed to this is randomly occurring. So all these components that are needed, the possibility of evolution, the possibility of a sex drive, the possibility of different life forms living at the same time and evolving at the same time, the possibility of matter coming into being, the possibility of thinking, the possibility of having a drive to connect to something greater. Why do these possibilities exist? Why are these things that exist? To argue that you think it's magically more logical, which obviously it isn't, for these things to have occurred randomly, that argument is crazy. And the person arguing that is insane. Going back to the sniper example. If someone ignores tons of evidence, the evidence, the evidence, the points of evidence are like the grains of sand on the beach, and says, hey, let's just proceed as if there's no sniper in that building or that tree. Okay, they're not your friend. There's some kind of complex having bitch that's trying to bring you down. You need to understand that. Because even if you can't sense God, it is insane to go through life as if God doesn't exist, as if, he's not concerned with justice, what have you. Point number 7. Or rather, the seventh thing they must consider, that is. If the opposition views arguments are so logical, why do they avoid these key points and resort to scientific and intellectual jargon until a monotheistic scientist or someone like me takes the time to figure out why they are wrong and rebukes them. So they'll use all kinds of fancy words. This happens all the time. They'll say dumb stuff, and then they'll start trolling you and hacking you and so on and so forth when you're beating them in a debate. That's been my experience. Or after you beat them. Discussion, debate, argument, what have you. And sometimes they'll send someone later who speaks a lot of intellectual jargon and tries to kind of snob you using that intellectual jargon, which is very laughable. You ever heard the saying that, the smart man knows how much he doesn't know, or the wise man knows that he knows very little. Yet these people who come from that kind of school of thought turn around and say, we have a PhD in quantum physics or some nonsense like that. It's stupid. Their argument is dumb. And when you take the time to see what the word means, what they're getting at, where they get that from, you're like, look, that doesn't make sense. You just tried to use intellectual jargon. Why resort to that tactic if you're so sure that society or an individual shouldn't go through life with the belief, the true belief, that there's a God? Okay, so now we're into the second point. All that was part of the first point, right? The atheists and the non-monotheistic religions have to address those 7 things that I brought up. They cannot do it. And since they cannot do it, the rational mind, a clear thinker, someone who is logical and reasonable, is going to default with, there is a God. Or at least they must go through life with the belief that there is a God, because that has yielded the top life ever, the top martial artist ever possible. Okay? And because the evidence points to that. And in life, all we have, scientifically speaking, is the logical assumption. When you're speaking religiously, we can say with certainty, if we can say with certainty, that is, if we actually have sensed God and experienced God, that there's a God. On the same token, I caution you, the vast majority of people on this planet who have argued that they have sensed God basically haven't. They've sensed something that God has created, but they haven't sensed God. It's their mere emotions. It's their mere brain. It's similar to the part of the brain that would sense God, absolutely. I'm certain of that. Just like if your eyes play tricks on you, it's still your eyes. It's still your brain. But they haven't actually sensed God. Because when you experience God, you believe in God, you move in a certain way. You move in submission to God. They're not doing that. To sense God is to fear God more than everything else and anything else, and infinitely so. So point number 2, the issue of censorship. It is not reasonable for someone to censor a person when they are trying to tell the truth, or when they are trying to explore if homosexuality is or isn't a mental illness. Society did not scramble to stop gang violence or end homelessness when it is very easy to do, and there is 162 trillion plus with the top 50% of people in society, when for $100 billion one could easily house all the homeless. So why would preventing people from an honest exploration of how one's mental health and homosexuality are related be reasonable? How would that be reasonable? In other words, if you care so much about LGBT people that you don't want them to be persecuted or something, and you have the power to scramble and censor free speech, you would think that you'd have the power to house homeless people, which, at least according to some LGBT activists, are disproportionately LGBT. Some of these people have been to prison and they turned gay in prison. Some of these people are just LGBT people who do drugs. Some of these people are LGBT people who work and can't afford living like everyone else, right? People are people, right? But they're not trying to help them. Instead, they're just politicking. So we can ascertain that they don't actually try to protect LGBT people when they censor speech on YouTube, for example. That they're just politicking. And that's wrong. Not to mention all the LGBT people in gangs. There's quite a few of them these days. Point number 3. It is not reasonable to say, well, we like things this way, and to leave it at that. There are people that take that route. Okay, that's not reasonable. When an individual or society does that, that's not reasonable. Especially if they say, if you don't like it, go somewhere else. That is sick. That is pathetic. That's tyranny. That's stupidity. It's ignorance. Point number 4. It is not reasonable for someone to say to you that you should go somewhere else if you do not like it when America is supposed to be a free country. And America was instrumental in using proxies to mess up the rest of the world. Look up the history of the Cold War if you don't understand that it's a fact, an easily provable fact, that proxy warfare and proxy activities and foreign policy drastically shaped the underdeveloped nations of the world. I go as far as say it's clear cut that the current state of the underdeveloped nations in the world is mostly the product of Western and Western interference and the interference that came from other developed nations as well. That's a fact. How are you going to then say, well, you don't like it, go somewhere else? That's like somebody's trying to get you to date their daughter and she's not that attractive. And every attractive female would prefer you if they're thinking straight. And they beat the crap out of some chick somewhere and they say, well, you have one other option, is that chick over there who we beat up. You see, when people don't understand that that's not fair, they're sick, they're demonic, they're childish, they're immature, they're poorly bred, they're poorly raised, etc. Clear cut. And a reasonable person isn't those things. Point number 5. When these things are clearly as simple as 1 + 1 = 2 when spelled out, and it is not very hard to spell them out, it is not reasonable for people to default, write that word down, default, with, well, what about this or that, and to play technicality games instead of starting here as it is the logical assumption as monotheism is the logical assumption. Think about the default point. Think about the best explanation. Okay. Also, ironically, cute fact that the word censorship starts with the word sense. So if you have sense and you're talking sense, you get censored. And they want to define what is sense and what isn't, right? The word censorship is like the word worship and sponsorship. And the word worship is like the phrase warship. War-ship and war shape. And they say shape up or ship out. And ships are associated with being in port, right? And they call the ship it being in berth. And a teammate, a shipmate. Not a coincidence that these words are connected. It's tyranny. It's a cult behind the scenes tyranny. Authoritarianism, totalitarianism, oligarchical cult madness, really. So what do I mean by technicality games? Okay, say, you hear some kid screaming for help. And like, oh my gosh, and they see this guy and this kid's bloody, covered in blood, and then this crazy looking people person is like taking him to a car. Okay? And let's say, you're put in the back of a police car unfairly for something you didn't do. And you say, look over there, that kid is being kidnapped right now, and you're arresting me for something I didn't do, right? You just have me cut me loose. Like, I have no evidence, this is not reasonable. And the police officers go, well, how do you know that's not their dad, or he's just playing a game, or that's not ketchup? That's technicality bitch shit. The logical assumption is, do something about that, you stupid fuck. Even if you have to leave the suspect in the back of the car, drive over there, pull out your gun, whatever you got to do, and say, hey, what's going on here? If the motherfucker doesn't, he's a piece of shit. And so it is when we're talking about the logical assumption where it matters most. The society, when America doesn't end homelessness, because it's a logical assumption that's the right thing to do, it's the way forward, it's better for the economy, what have you. Cost-effective spending, enough oversight to make sure the money goes where it's supposed to go, okay, wealth taxes, whatever. It's because they're not being reasonable. Okay? And we literally have to start off with explaining to people what is reasonable and why. Why in a secular nation do they say in God we trust, one nation under God? Because the logical assumption to the masses of people with weak faith, with little faith in America, no faith, was that there is a God. To this day, there is no viable counter-argument when it comes to the logical assumption. After that, it's a matter of faith. It's a matter of connecting to God, what have you, right? Reason and faith, the logical assumption. Okay. So we're on the next point here. I believe it was point 6, because I numbered it wrong because I can't look at the screen too long when I type these things up. So point 6. It is not reasonable to tell the top martial artist, who is me, and I am mulatto, right? Part black, part white, part Jewish as well. And, hardly part Jewish is not naturally expressed to me very much. It's a story for another day, how they edit my videos and pictures and film me and doing funny things to try to confuse you about that. But anyway, it is not reasonable to tell the top martial artist, who is me, and I am mulatto, that if you do things in a way to elevate the governing class or any other group, that then they will admit some of these things. That is not just unreasonable, it is evil and immature. It is satanic. Okay, because I'm here to serve God, not to, just give atheists a hard time or polytheistics a hard time or agnostics. I'm here to actually serve God, not to elevate a satanic group of people that pretends to serve God, not to make the broad path seem like the right path, but the straight and narrow, to tell people the reality of the situation and what happens after my flesh dies, to tell people that no one should reproduce no matter what, that it's not logical, it's not reasonable to do so. Technology, right? Artificial intelligence, brain hacking, right? Horrible breeding, cheating, generational ill-gotten gains that made it so only crazy people reproduce. And I know so many people are reproducing, but that's the truth here. Okay, point 7. It is not reasonable for people to play stupid instead of defaulting with common decency. Point number 8. It is not reasonable to default with white social norms and every disprovable white scale of idealness, when universal logic is the reality, as far as anyone knows, for the agnostic and for certain for the monotheistic person with common sense or better. So let's stop here. There's a reason why in Luke 12, verse 57, it says, why don't you judge for yourselves what is right? Okay. Because it's universal. Okay, why don't you judge for yourselves? When you see Christ proving his point, it's always universal. He says, aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny, or whatever he says? He's using logic. So the house can divide, it cannot stand. It is not what goes into someone's mouth that defiles them, it's what comes out of their mouth. It says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That sums up the law and the prophets. That sums up the 10 commandments. It sums up everything. You should already know what's right. Love God with all your heart is the greatest commandment. It's, all the law and the prophets hang on this. And what does it mean to love somebody? You should already know it's universal. It's not limited to white social norms. It's not limited to white culture. In fact, white culture, and keep in mind I'm part white, doesn't do a very good job of it, of teaching people these things. We're in a country that's mostly white culture, and no one's obeying God through me. So it's not the ideal kind of vineyard or plot of land to cultivate the Spirit of God in. And we know by its fruits. We know by the unreasonable nature of people of every race in this country. And all the subcultures that are basically white culture heavy. Okay. For example, when I was young, the teachers in school would point out that many people disagree with the excessive homework, and they often cite that later in life people do not often use these things, right? They would put extras on the importance of mathematics and having a high level understanding of history and science. Now, if you're going to be certain things like an engineer, maybe a pilot, maybe a mathematician, right? Maybe you're going to be a biologist, or you might need a lot of the science there, but a lot of it isn't that important. And even before the internet came out, you could always pick up a book and learn it if you needed to learn it later. So why pile it on a child instead of teaching them critical thinking? Why teach them to be a parrot? Okay, and keep in mind it's a Judeo-Christian culture, because their conception of how to serve God, really isn't a conception of how to serve God. It's a conception of how to serve the devil. That's a story for another day. They think that you need to not think effectively, and you need to just memorize things, retain the information, and regurgitate it like a robot. And every once in a while you get into college, there's a little critical thinking, but for the most part, these people don't critical think. No, they don't think critically. Most females, for example, in America, who are adults, have a college degree. But do they date effectively? Do they vote effectively? Do they rally effectively and end homelessness? No. There's a 50% divorce rate. Same with guys. Think about it. That has everything to do with school and the years of development. There's all kinds of psychologists like Erik Erikson who talk about, various theories of development, developmental theories. Mental development, human development, what have you. The stages of development. Okay. Ultimately, they would point to the white social norms that went into creating the school, right? When they put extras on it. They're not pointing to universal logic. They're saying things like, this is how it is done. Well, you'll understand later in life. Well, here I'm in later in life. Not only do I not agree with them, I've made several videos about it, maybe 10, 20, 30, 40 videos about it. And no one has a counter argument. And other people are making videos about it as well. So why did we default with white social norms in the school system and torture millions and millions of students? Tons of people dropping out when they otherwise wouldn't have. And when the smoke clears, we have a very racist, white, Jew, and LGBT-run society with token minorities? You think that's a coincidence? You know them by their works, by their fruits, by their deeds, by their plan, by their insistence on their plan, by their social control. Later on in life, I've come across many white people who want people to all blame the Jews. Depending on how you define Jews, they are disproportionately involved, as they are disproportionately rich, and are accepted in a certain way. However, depending on how you define white and Jewish, most of the people involved are white. It is difficult to say who is doing it on the highest level. Next point, I think we're on point 8 here. It is unreasonable for attractive females to try to get the top martial arts ever possible to change his dating scale and to all shun me and try to get me to settle. Now, some people were like, well, who are you to this, this, and this? Okay, if I told you when Michael Jordan was young, all attractive females shunned him, okay, you'd be like, what? You wouldn't believe it. But you think it's reasonable for all attractive females to shun the top martial arts ever possible? Basketball is just basketball. It was a game invented one day in recent history, fairly modern history. Martial arts goes back, arguably, several 100,000 years. That was the true measure of somebody. The king wears a sword, doesn't carry a basketball, doesn't carry a trowel, doesn't carry a magic wand unless he's a bitch. Like, what don't you people get? Can you imagine someone who doesn't understand that? Have you never heard females say, oh my gosh, he's so sexy? Imagine you have the top martial arts ever possible body, forged by righteousness, and the soul that forged it. Martial is marital scrambled, as in marriage. And I, Christ, the Christos, the anointed top martial artist, and the bridegroom, the idea that David and Goliath is superimposed on, right? That my top martial arts victory, Dave ID, the idea of it in its pinnacle, that is. But you think that it's reasonable for all attractive females to shun me and to participate in the process of cheating me out of my right to lead. Now, for those of you who still don't get that, because you're some kind of a white supremacist, Jewish supremacist, token minority idiot, some kind of thug with no higher cause, some kind of LGBT radical, maybe with money, maybe just a drug addict or something. For those who don't get that because you probably just got done raping a kid, let me explain it to you some more. Not only are the key reasons obvious at first glance. But on top of this, all kinds of unsavory characters get attractive females. Rich scum, porn stars, politicians, immoral lawyers, crooked cops, like the cop who killed George Floyd. His name was Derek Chauvin or something, who was married to a very attractive model. Drug dealers, rich old perverts, many racists, and more. But you think it's reasonable for that society's sum total communication to be that their attractive women shun the top martial arts ever possible? I would never be proud of such a society, ever. Fuck those fucking cowards. Think about it. Okay, so I went over time now. I got some more points. We'll have to do a part 2. Thank you.